Ever wonder what medieval women were really like? Did they just sit around waiting for a knight in shining armor, or were their lives way more complicated than the stories tell us? Get ready to explore 8 common fictional tropes about medieval women that have stuck around for centuries, even though the past, from the 5th to the 15th century, might have a different story to tell. Number 8, the property. When you watch a medieval movie or historical fantasy show, how often do you see a woman treated like a chess piece? She is moved around by her father, her brother, or some powerful lord, her feelings and wishes completely ignored. She is married off her land for an alliance or for money, often to a much older, unpleasant man. She has no voice, no power, and no escape. She is literally just property, an object of exchange, a tool for men to secure their power or wealth. This image of the medieval woman as a passive commodity is deeply ingrained in our collective imagination. You see it in countless adaptations of historical events, where noblewomen are tearfully led to their predetermined fates, their dowries being the only topic of discussion. The very idea of love or personal choice in marriage seems completely absent for these characters, their lives dictated entirely by the men around them. Her value is measured by her lineage, her fertility, and the size of the lands she brings to a union. Her identity is not her own, but merely an extension of her family's status and ambitions. This portrayal often leaves audiences thinking that medieval women were entirely stripped of individual will or agency, existing solely to be moved between male guardians. It suggests that their entire existence was external, defined by others, and that they had no internal life or aspirations beyond what was expected of them. But let us take a closer look at what historical records and scholarly research reveal about the lives of medieval women, and we might find a much more complex picture. While arranged marriages were indeed very common, especially among the nobility and wealthy merchants, the idea that women had absolutely no say is far from the whole story. For instance, church law, which held significant sway across medieval Europe, actually stipulated that for a marriage to be valid, both parties had to give their consent. This consent might sometimes be coerced, especially for those at the top of society, but it was still a legal requirement. Historical records show cases where women appealed to ecclesiastical courts to annul marriages they claimed were forced, and sometimes these appeals were successful. This suggests that the legal framework, at least in theory, recognized a woman's individual will in such a critical life event. A woman's ability to resist, even if only through legal channels, challenges the simple property narrative. Consider the economic aspects of marriage. While a woman often came with a dowry, which was a significant transfer of wealth or property to her husband's family, she also typically received a dower. The dower was a portion of her husband's estate, often 1/3, that she would control for the rest of her life if she became a widow. This dower was legally hers, providing her with economic security and a degree of independence. She could manage this property, derive income from it, and make decisions about its use. This was not merely a handout, it was a recognized legal right that empowered widows to function as independent economic actors. Research by historians like Martha Howell and Judith Bennett has extensively documented the economic activities and legal standing of medieval widows, showing them managing estates, conducting business, and even appearing in court on their own behalf. These women were not mere objects. They were landowners, employers, and legal persons. Beyond noble circles, in the bustling towns and villages, women's economic roles were often even more pronounced. Urban women, particularly if widowed or single, could own and operate businesses. They ran taverns, bakeries, workshops, and stalls in markets. Many guild statutes, which governed trades and crafts, included provisions for women to work in these trades, sometimes alongside their husbands, and sometimes independently. A wife working in her husband's trade was not just helping out, she was often an integral part of the business, possessing skills and knowledge vital to its success. Upon her husband's death, she might inherit the business and continue to run it, becoming a fully recognized master of the trade. This active participation in the economy directly contradicts the idea of women as passive commodities. Their labor, their skills, and their entrepreneurial spirit were recognized and valued within the medieval economy. Furthermore, within the legal structures of the time, women could and did exercise agency regarding property and their own lives. In England, for example, under common law, a wife's legal identity was often subsumed under her husband's, a concept known as coverture. However, even under coverture, a wife might have separate property rights or be able to engage in legal actions if she was a merchant or if her husband was absent. And as mentioned, widows were largely independent legal entities, able to own property, enter into contracts, and even sue or be sued in court. Records from manorial courts and royal courts demonstrate that women actively participated in the legal system to protect their interests, whether it was defending their land rights, collecting debts, or seeking justice. These were not the actions of helpless individuals with no control over their own lives. Consider specific historical figures who directly challenge this property trope. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, inherited vast territories in her own right, ruled them effectively, and played a central role in European politics through her marriages to two kings. She was not a piece of property, she was a major landowner and a political force. Blanche of Castile, regent for her son, King Louis IX of France, effectively governed the kingdom, put down rebellions, and secured her son's inheritance. Her political acumen and power were undeniable. These examples, far from being isolated anomalies, illustrate that within the medieval framework, women, particularly those of high status, could wield immense power and exercise significant personal and political agency. Even within the expected roles of wives and mothers, women managed large households, oversaw estates, and often ran complex administrative operations which required considerable skill and authority. Their lives were not just about being exchanged, they were about management, negotiation, and often survival in a challenging world. Number 7. The Dark Ages woman. This trope paints medieval women as living in a world of extreme superstition, ignorance, and squalor. She is often portrayed as unhygienic, uneducated, and deeply entrenched in primitive beliefs, always fearing witches and demons or being one herself. Her life is short, brutal, and devoid of any intellectual or refined pursuits. She lives in perpetually dirty conditions, rarely bathes, and has a very limited understanding of the world beyond her village. This portrayal often comes with a subtle implication that women, especially, were more susceptible to the supposed intellectual darkness of the era, easily swayed by fear and unscientific notions. You see this trope in many historical dramas that emphasize grimness, where characters often wear ill-fitting, dirty clothes, and hygiene seems a foreign concept. The focus is on dirt, disease, and a pervasive sense of intellectual stagnation, suggesting a complete lack of progress or refinement. This image reinforces the idea that the entire medieval period was a backward slide from classical antiquity, and women within it were particularly emblematic of this perceived decline. However, historical evidence offers a much more nuanced view of daily life, hygiene, and intellectual pursuits in the Middle Ages for both men and women. The term Dark Ages itself is largely a misnomer, a construct of later periods that ignored significant advancements and complexities. For instance, medieval people were far from universally unhygienic. While modern plumbing was absent, personal cleanliness was often valued, particularly among the wealthy. Public bathhouses were common in many towns and cities across Europe, and records show they were well used by both men and women. Private residences, especially those of the affluent, often had access to water for washing, and people used various soaps and cleansing agents made from plant ashes and animal fats. Even among the lower classes, washing was practiced, particularly hands and face, and clothes were cleaned, though perhaps less frequently than today. The idea of medieval people being uniformly filthy is an exaggeration rooted in later prejudices, not historical reality. Accounts of daily life from household records often mention the provision of water and towels for washing, especially before meals. Regarding education and intellectual life, the stereotype of universal ignorance for medieval women is also deeply flawed. While formal schooling was not as widespread as it is today, education took many forms, and women participated in it significantly. For noble women, education often included literacy, needlework, household management, and sometimes even Latin, history, and law. Women like Christine de Pizan, an educated widow of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, became one of the first professional female writers in Europe, producing works on history, morality, and even advising on governance. Her works, such as the Book of the City of Ladies, actively challenged negative stereotypes about women. She was a scholar, a poet, and a sharp critic of misogynistic literature, demonstrating a high level of intellectual engagement. Her religious institutions also provided opportunities for women's education and intellectual development. Convents and abbeys were centers of learning where nuns were educated in Latin, theology, music, and various crafts. Many abbesses were highly educated and powerful figures, managing large estates, libraries, and even influencing political affairs. Hildegard von Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, was a prolific writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and even a natural scientist and medical practitioner. Her works on natural history and medicine, her theological treatises, and her musical compositions demonstrate a profound intellectual depth that completely shatters the ignorant woman trope. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, showing the respect given to her intellect and spiritual authority. Beyond the elite, practical education was common for most women. Girls learned skills necessary for running a household, farming, or a trade from their mothers and other female relatives. This practical knowledge, passed down through generations, was vital for survival and prosperity. Urban women often learned to read and write for the purposes of commerce, managing accounts, and maintaining correspondence for their businesses. Court records and wills sometimes show women signing documents, indicating at least a basic level of literacy. While the overall literacy rate was lower than today, it was not non-existent for women, and it varied greatly by social class and region. The notion that medieval women were entirely unlettered, therefore, is an oversimplification. The idea of rampant superstition also needs careful examination. While religious belief was pervasive and the concept of magic and the supernatural was present, it was often intertwined with Christian theology and folk practices. Many women acted as healers, using herbal remedies and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. These practices, while not always scientifically understood, were often effective and were a valued part of community healthcare. They were not inherently superstitious in a derogatory sense, but rather a practical application of available knowledge. The widespread fear of witches, as depicted in later eras, especially the early modern period's witch hunts, was not as prevalent throughout the entire medieval period, particularly the early and high Middle Ages. The legal frameworks and societal attitudes regarding magic evolved over time. In summary, the Dark Ages woman trope ignores the significant intellectual contributions of medieval women, their varied educational experiences, and the actual practices of hygiene that were common in the era. It paints a picture of a uniformly primitive and backward existence that does not fully capture the diverse and often sophisticated lives of women across medieval society. Number 6. The warrior woman. This trope features a medieval woman who is a skilled fighter, clad in armor, wielding swords or bows, and often leading armies or engaging in direct combat alongside men. She is fearless, physically formidable, and frequently surpasses her male counterparts in battle prowess. While she might be an inspiring figure, this portrayal often feels anachronistic, suggesting that medieval society was far more accepting of women in direct military roles than historical evidence supports. You see her in many fantasy epics and some historical dramas, often as an anomaly, a chosen one, or someone who defies all societal expectations. She's Joan of Arc, but without the historical nuance, or perhaps a more idealized version of a shield maiden from Norse sagas. She is the brave heroine who stands shoulder to shoulder with knights, fighting on the front lines, a symbol of female empowerment through physical might. While compelling, this image often overshadows the more common and historically accurate ways medieval women demonstrated strength and agency. And this trope, while visually striking, often flattens the complexities of medieval gender roles and military organization. While the image of a woman in full plate armor charging into battle might be popular in fiction, actual historical instances of women leading armies or fighting as knights are extremely rare, and when they did occur, they were often exceptional cases viewed through a specific cultural or religious lens. Warfare in the Middle Ages was a highly specialized and brutal affair, demanding immense physical training, specific equipment, and an established social structure. The physical demands of medieval armor and weaponry were formidable, and direct combat was usually reserved for men of specific social classes, primarily knights and professional soldiers. The expectation for women, even those of the nobility, was generally not to engage in direct combat, but to manage estates, uphold family honor, and produce heirs. This does not mean medieval women were not strong or brave. Their strength was often manifested in different, equally vital ways. However, it is crucial to understand that women did play significant roles in warfare, just not typically on the front lines as armed combatants. Noblewomen, particularly, were often responsible for the defense of castles and estates when their husbands were away fighting. They would oversee garrisons, organize supplies, maintain morale, and direct defensive operations. For example, during sieges, chatelaines, female castellan or castle owners would manage the castle's resources, strategize with their captains, and endure prolonged periods of danger. Jeanne de Montfort, known as Jeanne the Flame, famously defended her castle of Hennebont in Brittany against the French during the Breton War of Succession in the 14th century, even leading a counterattack herself. She was not a knight, but a noble woman defending her holdings, demonstrating extraordinary courage and leadership. Another notable example is Agnes Randolph, Countess of Dunbar, also known as Black Agnes, who in 1338 famously defended Dunbar Castle against a siege by the English for 5 months. She mocked the besiegers from the ramparts and effectively managed the defense, preventing the English from taking the fortress. These women were not warriors in the sense of wielding swords in battle, but they were formidable leaders and defenders, demonstrating strategic acumen and immense resilience under pressure. Their strength lay in their ability to organize, command, and endure, which was just as vital to medieval warfare as a knight's prowess in a charge. Furthermore, women provided essential logistical and support services for armies. They worked as cooks, laundresses, nurses, and suppliers, often following armies on campaign. While not glamorous, these roles were absolutely critical to maintaining a fighting force. Without the often unseen labor of these women, armies could not function. This contribution, though not involving direct combat, was a form of participation in warfare that was widespread and fundamental. Then there is the highly specific case of Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed divine guidance and led the French army to several important victories in the 15th century. Joan of Arc is the quintessential warrior woman in historical memory. However, her story is so unique precisely because it was so exceptional and defied all conventional norms. She was not a knight, nor did she fight in the same way a knight would. Her role was primarily one of inspirational leadership, strategy, and spiritual guidance, rather than direct combat, though she did wear armor and carry a banner. Her historical significance stems from her extraordinary nature, proving the rule that women did not typically serve as direct combatants in medieval armies. She was a divinely sanctioned anomaly, not a typical representation of women in medieval warfare. In essence, while medieval women were undoubtedly capable of immense bravery, leadership, and resilience, and while they played crucial support roles in times of conflict, the image of the universally skilled female warrior fighting on the battlefield is largely a modern fantasy. It is a powerful trope that speaks to contemporary desires for strong female characters, but it often misrepresents the specific ways medieval women contributed to and experienced warfare. Their strength was often demonstrated through strategic defense, economic management, and enduring hardship, rather than through wielding a sword in the thick of battle. Number 5. The pure, virtuous lady. This trope presents medieval women, particularly those of noble birth, as impossibly pure, chaste, and morally flawless figures. She is the epitome of grace and innocence, often depicted as a fragile beauty in flowing gowns, waiting patiently for her knight. Her virtues are absolute, her moral compass unwavering, and her primary role is to embody an idealized standard of feminine perfection. She is the object of chivalric adoration, placed on a pedestal, often without any discernible personality flaws or complex motivations. She is often seen blushing at any hint of impropriety and appears completely removed from the practicalities or less savory aspects of life. This characterization often strips her of agency and makes her a symbol rather than a real person, leaving no room for ambition, anger, or any human imperfection. She exists to be admired, protected, and to serve as a moral anchor, often in a world of otherwise flawed men. You see her in many romanticized historical narratives, where her sole purpose seems to be to represent an abstract ideal rather than a living, breathing individual. However, historical records reveal that medieval women, like all people, were complex individuals with a full range of human emotions, desires, and moral complexities. The idea of universal, unwavering purity and virtue is a romanticized construction, not a historical reality. While chastity and piety were indeed valued virtues within medieval Christian society, especially for women, they were ideals that people strove for, often imperfectly, rather than a universal state of being. Medieval society was not as morally simplistic as this trope suggests. For instance, women held diverse roles within the medieval social structure, each with its own set of expectations and practical realities. Noble women, while expected to be chaste and pious, also played crucial roles in managing large households, estates, and even participating in political intrigues. They often had significant power and influence, which sometimes involved making pragmatic, and perhaps morally ambiguous, decisions. Eleanor of Aquitaine, far from a meek, pure lady, was a powerful ruler, a patron of the arts, and a figure involved in political power struggles, divorcing one king and marrying another. Her life was marked by independence, ambition, and a willingness to challenge norms, which is far from the passive, virtuous lady trope. Her grandmother, Eleanor of Châtellerault, also known for her strong personality and independence, further shows a pattern of influential women in the Aquitaine lineage. The queens and high-ranking noblewomen often acted as regents for their young sons, exercising significant political power, engaging in diplomacy, and even leading armies as discussed in the warrior woman section, though not in direct combat. Blanche of Castile, regent for her son Louis IX, was a formidable political figure who suppressed rebellions, negotiated treaties, and effectively ruled France. In her actions, while ultimately aimed at securing her son's throne, demonstrated strategic intelligence, determination, and a willingness to engage in the messy realities of power politics, which goes far beyond the limited scope of a pure virtuous symbol. Furthermore, medieval literature itself, while often promoting ideals of chivalry and courtly love, also reveals a more complex understanding of women. While some poetic works place women on a pedestal, other genres, such as Fabliau's short, often humorous and bawdy tales, depicted women with all their human flaws, desires, and cunning. These stories, which were popular among various social classes, show women engaging in affairs, tricking their husbands, or pursuing their own interests, highlighting a realistic appreciation for the diversity of human behavior, including female behavior. This suggests that the public perception of women was not solely confined to the idealized pure lady. In religious life, women actively sought spiritual fulfillment and sometimes challenged conventional norms. While many nuns and anchoresses embodied piety, they also engaged in intellectual pursuits, wrote theological treatises, and managed significant religious institutions. Saint Clare of Assisi, a contemporary of Saint Francis, founded the Order of Poor Ladies Claresses and actively resisted attempts by the Pope to soften her order's strict rule of poverty, showing fierce determination and conviction. These women were not just passively pure, they were active agents in their spiritual lives, often pushing boundaries and exercising intellectual and spiritual authority. Beyond the elite, peasant and urban women had practical lives filled with labor, child-rearing, and community involvement. Their virtue was often defined by their industriousness, their ability to manage a household, and their contribution to the family economy. They were not fragile beings, they were resilient and active participants in their communities, dealing with the harsh realities of agricultural life, disease, and economic hardship. The idea of constant purity might not even have been a relevant concern for women whose lives were dominated by survival and practical work. Historical records, such as manorial court rolls, show peasant women involved in disputes, owning property, and sometimes even committing petty crimes, demonstrating that their lives were as messy and complicated as anyone else's. The notion of a universally pure, morally unblemished woman across all social strata is therefore highly misleading. Number 4. The uneducated peasant. This trope portrays medieval peasant women as entirely uneducated, illiterate, and lacking any knowledge beyond their immediate daily tasks of farming or household chores. She is depicted as simple-minded, easily superstitious, and wholly unconcerned with anything intellectual or artistic. Her life is confined to the fields and the hearth, with no opportunity or desire for learning. This image reinforces the idea that the vast majority of medieval women, particularly those outside the nobility or religious orders, lived lives utterly devoid of mental stimulation or any form of intellectual development. You often see her as a background character in historical films, an embodiment of the era's perceived backwardness, speaking in a very simple, unrefined manner and often looking bewildered by anything beyond her immediate surroundings. This trope suggests a complete absence of curiosity or learning in the lives of ordinary medieval women, reducing them to purely physical laborers. However, historical research reveals a far more complex picture of education and practical knowledge among medieval peasant women, and indeed, women across different social classes. While formal literacy, meaning the ability to read and write Latin, the language of scholarship and the church, was limited for many people, both male and female medieval education was not solely defined by book learning. Practical knowledge, vocational skills, and oral traditions were incredibly important forms of education, and women were central to their transmission. Peasant women, for example, possessed an extensive and sophisticated body of knowledge essential for survival and prosperity. They were often experts in agriculture, understanding crop rotation, animal husbandry, and soil conditions. They knew about foraging for wild foods, preserving harvests, and preparing meals. They had deep knowledge of herbal medicine, acting as primary healers for their families and communities. This included understanding the properties of various plants, how to prepare remedies, and how to treat common ailments, injuries, and even childbirth. This knowledge was often passed down orally from mother to daughter through generations, a vital system of education that ensured the well-being of the community. This was not simple knowledge, it was complex, empirical, and essential for the daily functioning of medieval society. Beyond the fields, women in villages and towns were often engaged in various crafts and trades. They spun wool, wove cloth, made clothes, brewed ale, baked bread, and processed dairy products. Many were skilled artisans, contributing significantly to the local economy. For example, in towns, women worked as chandlers, mercers, goldsmiths, and even barbers. This guild records, particularly from the later Middle Ages, show women listed as members of various craft guilds, indicating that they not only learned these trades but also practiced them professionally. A woman who was a baker, for instance, needed to understand measurements, ingredients, and the science of fermentation, skills that were acquired through rigorous apprenticeship and practical experience, much like any male artisan. This practical vocational education was a form of learning that was widely accessible to and utilized by women. While formal schooling was less common for peasant girls than for boys, some opportunities existed. In certain areas, parish schools might admit girls, and some wealthy families among the peasantry or free farmers might hire tutors for their daughters. Furthermore, religious institutions, particularly convents, provided education not just for noble women, but sometimes also for women from lower social strata who intended to join the religious life. These institutions taught literacy, basic arithmetic, and religious texts. Even for those who were not formally literate, oral culture was rich and vibrant. Stories, songs, proverbs, and religious teachings were transmitted verbally, forming a crucial part of intellectual life. Women played a key role in preserving and transmitting these oral traditions, particularly through storytelling to children and within their communities. They were keepers of local history, folklore, and practical wisdom. The idea that peasant women were simple-minded and easily superstitious also misses the point. While religious belief was strong, and people often interpreted events through a spiritual lens, this was a characteristic of the entire society, not just uneducated women. Their lives required shrewdness, resilience, and adaptability. They navigated complex social relationships, managed households, and made crucial decisions for their families. Their education was often experiential and practical, equipping them with the knowledge and skills necessary to thrive in their environment, a form of intelligence that is often overlooked when only formal literacy is considered. The absence of a university degree does not equate to a lack of intelligence or learning. Number 3, the seductress sorceress. This trope depicts medieval women, often those who are independent, mysterious, or sexually assertive, as dangerous and inherently evil. She is either a manipulative temptress using her beauty to ensnare men and gain power, or a dark sorceress wielding forbidden magic to harm others and defy natural order. This character often lacks genuine affection or moral compass, existing primarily to cause chaos or to serve as a foil to a virtuous hero or heroine. Her power is portrayed as inherently corrupting and threatening to societal norms. You see her in many fantasy narratives and some historical dramas, often with flowing dark hair, a knowing gaze, and a hidden agenda. She is Morgan Le Fay, but stripped of any complexity beyond pure malevolence, or a femme fatale whose beauty is a weapon. This trope plays on deep-seated fears about female power and autonomy, linking them directly to sin, temptation, or dangerous magical abilities. It suggests that if a woman wields any form of influence or power outside the traditional domestic sphere, it must be inherently sinister or supernatural. However, historical records and medieval cultural nuances present a far more complex understanding of women's sexuality, power, and any perceived connection to magic. The esotress trope often simplifies medieval attitudes towards female sexuality. While Christian doctrine emphasized chastity, particularly for unmarried women, medieval society also recognized and acknowledged female desire, albeit often within the confines of marriage. Women were not universally perceived as inherently manipulative or evil for possessing sexual appeal. In fact, many medieval love poems and songs, even those with religious undertones, celebrated female beauty and allure. The concept of courtly love, while highly idealized, often positioned the lady as an object of devotion whose beauty and perceived virtue could inspire men to greater deeds, rather than as a dangerous temptress. This was a complex cultural phenomenon, not a simple condemnation of female attraction. The sorceress part of the trope is also problematic. While belief in magic and witchcraft existed in the Middle Ages, the widespread systematic persecution of witches that we often associate with this period actually peaked much later, in the early modern era 16th, 18th centuries. In the medieval period, accusations of witchcraft were less common and less formalized, often categorized as heresy or minor magical practices. When they did occur, they targeted both men and women. The image of the witch as primarily an old wicked woman flying on a broomstick is largely a later development. Early medieval magic, often referred to as folk magic or cunning folk practices, involved herbal remedies, charms, and divinations, and it was practiced by both men and women to help their communities, not necessarily to cause harm. These practices were often tolerated or even sought after, particularly in rural areas, as a means of healing or predicting the future. Women who possessed knowledge of herbs and healing, often referred to as wise women, were vital members of their communities. They were often the primary source of medical care, assisting with childbirth, preparing remedies for illnesses, and offering advice. This practical knowledge was invaluable and generally respected, not feared as dark magic. While some of these practices might have been viewed with suspicion by the church, they were usually not automatically condemned as devilish witchcraft. The association of all female healers or knowledgeable women with malevolent magic is a later projection. Furthermore, medieval women, particularly those of high status, did exercise significant power and influence, often through intelligence, diplomacy, and strategic alliances, not through seduction or dark magic. Queens, abbesses, and noblewomen managed vast estates, advised rulers, and engaged in complex political negotiations. Their power was often derived from their lineage, their administrative skills, or their spiritual authority. For example, Christine de Pizan, an influential writer, actively challenged misogynistic views and advocated for women's capabilities and intelligence. She used her intellect and literary skill to assert women's place in society, not any form of supernatural power or manipulation. The centrist aspect often stems from patriarchal anxieties about female sexuality and power. If a woman gained influence or wealth outside male control, it was sometimes interpreted as a dangerous act, and attributing it to manipulation or witchcraft was a way to diminish her agency and invalidate her achievements. In reality, medieval women engaged in economic activities, managed households, and participated in social life with varying degrees of autonomy and influence, reflecting a much broader spectrum of experiences than the narrow seductress or sorceress archetype allows. Their actions were often rooted in practical necessity, family loyalty, or personal ambition, not a magical pact with dark forces. Number 2. The helpless homemaker. This pervasive trope depicts medieval women as exclusively confined to the domestic sphere, solely responsible for cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing, with no influence or involvement beyond the walls of their home. Her days are filled with endless drudgery, and her role is seen as entirely subordinate and without any significant economic or social value beyond maintaining the household. She is meek, passive, and utterly dependent on her husband for everything, lacking any individual agency or public presence. This image is often reinforced by visuals of women perpetually at the hearth, sewing, or caring for children, never venturing out or engaging with the broader world. You see her in countless portrayals where the woman's story arc begins and ends within the confines of her home, or where her only worry is the next meal or the cleanliness of her dwelling. This trope implies that women's contributions to medieval society were entirely private and isolated, with no connection to the larger economy or community, making her a powerless figure. However, historical records clearly demonstrate that the medieval homemaker was far from helpless or confined. Women across all social classes were active and integral participants in the economy and public life, even when their primary base was the household. The concept of household in the Middle Ages was much broader than our modern understanding, often encompassing not just family members, but also servants, apprentices, and even workers for a family business. The management of such a household was a complex, skilled, and economically vital undertaking. For instance, noblewomen were responsible for managing vast estates, which involved overseeing hundreds of servants, agricultural production, financial accounts, and even legal disputes. They would manage food supplies, administer justice on their lands, and ensure the smooth running of what was essentially a small economic and administrative unit. A great lady's household was a center of economic activity, and her effective management was crucial to her family's wealth and status. The records of household accounts, letters, and administrative documents from the medieval period frequently show noblewomen engaged in detailed financial planning, purchasing supplies, hiring and firing staff, and making significant economic decisions. These women were not merely cooking and cleaning, they were highly skilled administrators and managers operating complex enterprises that contributed directly to their family's power and prosperity. Among the urban classes, women were often co-partners in family businesses, or they ran their own independent ventures. Wives of merchants, artisans, and shopkeepers routinely worked alongside their husbands, learning the trade, handling accounts, and managing sales. If a husband died, it was common for the widow to inherit the business and continue to operate it, maintaining the family's livelihood. Women were involved in a wide range of crafts, from brewing and baking to weaving and selling goods in the market. Many women were members of craft guilds, indicating their professional status and contribution to the urban economy. For example, in London, women were involved in over 100 different trades, from embroiderers and silk weavers to goldsmiths and scriveners. These women were not just homemakers, they were active economic agents, contributing directly to the family income and the wider urban economy. Their labor was essential, and their presence in the marketplace was common. Even for peasant women, whose lives were undoubtedly hard and centered around the home and farm, their contributions were anything but helpless or economically insignificant. Peasant women worked in the fields alongside men, performing tasks like planting, harvesting, weeding, and tending to animals. They were also responsible for vital domestic production, turning raw materials into finished goods, spinning wool into yarn, weaving cloth, making clothes for the family, brewing ale, and processing food for preservation. This work was crucial for the family's survival and self-sufficiency, often providing goods and services that would otherwise have to be purchased. Their labor directly contributed to the household economy and was fundamental to the feudal system. They were not just homemakers in the modern sense, they were agricultural laborers, domestic manufacturers, and vital economic partners. Furthermore, women were active in their communities, participating in social networks, religious activities, and sometimes even local legal proceedings, as they might act as witnesses in court, manage property, or engage in disputes, demonstrating a public presence and legal agency that goes beyond simple domestic confinement. The idea that their lives were solely private, isolated, and without broader social impact is a misrepresentation. The medieval household was not a private refuge. It was a unit of production, a social hub, and often a visible part of the community's economic and social fabric. Number 1. The damsel in distress. This is arguably the most enduring and widely seen trope about medieval women. It portrays her as perpetually helpless, often a noblewoman, who is constantly in need of rescue from a male hero, whether it is a valiant knight, a cunning rogue, or a powerful wizard. She is often beautiful, passive, and utterly incapable of saving herself from dangers such as dragons, evil sorcerers, rival lords, or even her own family. Her primary function in the narrative is to be kidnapped, imprisoned, or imperiled, serving as a plot device to motivate the male protagonist's heroic journey. Her agency is non-existent, her character development minimal, and her emotional range often limited to fear or gratitude. You see her in almost every fairy tale, many medieval romances, and countless fantasy movies and video games that draw inspiration from the era. She is the princess locked in the tower, the innocent maiden tied to the tracks, or the noblewoman held captive by a villain, always waiting for someone else to resolve her predicament. This trope reduces medieval women to static objects, entirely dependent on male intervention for their survival and happiness. However, historical records, far from depicting medieval women as universally helpless, show them exercising agency, resourcefulness, and even direct action to protect themselves, their families, and their interests. While dangers certainly existed and physical strength might have been a male domain in warfare, women were not simply passive victims waiting for rescue. They actively navigated their world, often with considerable skill and determination. For instance, noble women, even when faced with political intrigue or siege, were not always helpless. As discussed earlier, figures like Jeanne de Montfort and Agnes Randolph actively organized the defense of their castles during prolonged sieges, demonstrating strategic leadership, resilience, and a fierce determination to protect their lands and families. They were not waiting in a tower, they were directing operations, enduring hardship, and inspiring their garrisons. Their actions were far from passive, they were acts of significant agency and bravery in the face of immense danger. The Eleanor of Aquitaine, herself a powerful ruler, was not a damsel in distress, but a major political player who navigated complex alliances and even challenged powerful male figures, including her own husband, the King of England. Her life was characterized by ambition, power, and self-determination. Beyond grand military actions, medieval women employed various forms of agency in their daily lives to protect themselves and their interests. In a society where legal recourse was available, women frequently appeared in court to defend their property rights, pursue debts, or seek justice for wrongs committed against them. Manorial court rolls, urban court records, and ecclesiastical court documents contain numerous instances of women acting as plaintiffs, defendants, and witnesses. They understood the legal system, used it to their advantage, and actively fought for their rights. This required knowledge, assertiveness, and the ability to articulate their cases, behaviors far removed from the image of a helpless victim. Moreover, medieval women across social strata often relied on networks of female kin, friends, and community members for support and protection. These informal networks provided vital assistance in times of need, whether it was during childbirth, illness, or conflict. Women looked out for each other, shared knowledge and provided practical and emotional support. This communal strength was a crucial form of self-reliance, demonstrating that women were not isolated and vulnerable individuals, but part of supportive social structures that allowed them to navigate challenges. In the face of personal threats or violence, medieval women were not always without means of defense. While not typically trained warriors, they could and did resist, whether through appealing to authorities, seeking refuge, or in some documented cases, even defending themselves physically when directly attacked. Records of criminal cases sometimes include instances where women fought back against assailants or where communities rallied to protect a woman in distress. Their helplessness was not a universal state, but rather a context-dependent reality, and they often found ways to cope and resist. Even in literature, while the damsel in distress trope was certainly present, it was not the only portrayal of women. Heroines like Guinevere, though sometimes portrayed as a helpless victim, also played crucial roles in courtly intrigues and held significant power within the Arthurian narratives. Strong, independent female characters also appeared in various medieval stories, folk tales, and even religious texts, embodying virtues like wisdom, courage, and resilience. The idealized image of the damsel was often balanced by other, more complex representations. The pervasive image of the perpetually helpless woman, therefore, simplifies the rich tapestry of medieval female experience and overlooks the countless instances where women demonstrated profound strength, resourcefulness, and agency in challenging circumstances.